do 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 do. All right, vlog post part 2. Horrible audio quality. Okay. I'm just gonna ramble on and kind of continue, along the same path as my previous video. I was talking about how monism you could see as very similar to idealism, but it's also similar to dualism and physicalism. So to get the physicalism out of the way real quick, well, first of all, let me recap. It's monism is similar to idealism in the sense that for example, when you look at the relationship between the physical and the non-physical, a monist would say that the physical, you wouldn't use the terms physical and non-physical. You would use terms like nous versus or you'd talk about essence versus substance, or you talk about description versus described, or spectral. I like that term. That's a term from Jason Reza Giorgiani. Spectral versus physical. What other synonyms for physical? You know what I'm talking about. So there's a relationship between those two. They're inseparable, and the physical one is made up of in neutral monism. I would say that you could easily consider the physical being made up of the non-physical, and so an idealist would look at that and say, aha, that's idealism, because you're saying that the physical is made up of non-physical. But there's a big difference there. The idealist says the physical is made of the non-physical, therefore the physical doesn't exist. But in neutral monism, it's completely different, because you don't say, well, one's made of the other, therefore the other doesn't exist. You say both of them have a relationship, and one can't exist without the other. So, like, for an example, in the physical category, you have an atom. And in the non-physical category, you have the characteristics of the atom, and just that right there proves monism, because there are atoms and there are characteristics of atoms, and the characteristics of atoms are inherent to all of the atoms. Every atom has the same inherent characteristics. Okay. Such as spin. So it's a characteristic. It's like non-physical. So an idealist would say, well, an atom is just the characteristics of an atom, so therefore atoms don't really exist. Well, in reality, because we're concerned with what reality is, not what a fantasy unicorn leprechaun world. We're interested in reality, and in reality, you have an atom with characteristics, and that's essentially what an atom is, except you can't remove the characteristics. You can't take them apart, and there is a a clear distinction in one's mind. And see, this is ontology. Really, what ontology is about is it's kind of like another form of psychology. It's not really the study of nature. It's really primarily the study of how the human brain can comprehend nature. And there is a hierarchy. Like, some of these are better than others. Okay, some ideas are just better. Not to say that any one of them is 100% accurate. But monism is the best, and it's because you can look at an atom and say, look, there's the atom right there. That's the atom. And that is the definition of physical. And it doesn't matter if you have... Well, anyway, there are a lot of differences. It's just, I'm not going to dwell on that subject too much, because that's not really what I was planning on talking about. It's just idealists that are dumb. I'm not going to belabor the point. Well, anyway, so you could kind of view idealism, monism, as kind of like idealism. Also, there's like the reality bubble thing. Idealists would say, see, it's idealism because, you have your own reality bubble. But there's an objective reality. So it's not idealism. To an idealist, you'd say, describe the color red. They can't do that because there are things that exist outside of an individual's mind. It's called objective reality. It's a place, they used to call it the Platonic realm. Qualia exist in objective reality outside of your consciousness. Essentially, you are not God, and you did not dream up the universe. Okay. So that's out of the way. A lot of time people look at monism and think, oh, that's physicalism. It's like a different form of materialism, and it is, because a monist will say, well, your mind is dependent upon your brain. So when you die, your consciousness is affected greatly. And that sounds like materialism. And it is technically a form of materialism. But, again, it's the same story with idealism. There's a huge difference between physicalism and monism. But mostly I wanted to talk about the possible apparent similarities between dualism and monism. So, simulation theory. I made a video criticizing, in particular, Neil deGrasse Tyson. I could criticize anyone talking about simulation theory. It doesn't matter, because I was just criticizing simulation theory itself. And my arguments were basically just against dualism. Oh man, so many dumb comments on that video. I have absolutely zero interest in entertaining people or having a large number of subscribers. I don't think of myself as a YouTuber, obviously. This is just like a vlog, and I'm really just trying to discuss things with intelligent people, and I'm using YouTube as a medium. So simulation theory, as it exists in the current state, when people use the term simulation theory, or whatever you want to call it, they're talking about dualism. You could say, you could use the phrase simulation theory, and you could be talking about monism, but whatever you're talking about is not what everyone else is talking about. Everyone's talking about a dualist universe when they talk about simulation theory. Like, one time I had this guy say he was going to pay me $10,000 through PayPal if I disproved simulation theory. And I said, okay, bring it on. And I did. I disproved the dualist simulation theory. And he's like, no, that's not what simulation theory is. And he had some weird, actually monist view of simulation theory, where you're not. He kind of viewed it as like a video game where your consciousness isn't actually inside the simulation. Anyway, my argument, I was just, it was dumb. A dumb and a waste of time. It's dualist, okay? Simulation theory is dualist. I could come up with a theory. In fact, I have. I've come up with a theory which is 100% monist, purely monist, which sounds a lot like simulation theory. In fact, another word which I learned from Jason Reza Georgiani as well is the word simulacra or simulacrum, which is a monist term to express that the world as it really exists, beyond the perception of humanity or beyond the perception of life, is actually an illusion. And that concept of a simulacrum is vastly different than the simulation theory that's kind of floating around today. So the way I look at it is with the analogy of the Plato's cave, the allegory of the cave, where there are people in a cave, they're chained up, and all they can see are shadows of puppets or whatever on a wall, and they don't know what the outside is like. They don't know what actual reality is. All they can see is shadows. And for a long time I've viewed that as like metaphorical, mostly metaphorical, like maybe people are blinded by materialistic endeavors, and the enlightened ones say to be more ascetic and think about things that are greater than you, and that's generally what enlightenment is. So it's kind of like a metaphorical, like a social commentary, and the enlightened person is murdered because they're rattling the cage. But actually, it's in a way it is more direct. in the sense that the human perception itself is like the cave, and through a rare stroke of genius, an enlightened person has realized that our perception does not match reality 100%. And that is actually a scientific fact. And there's a word for it. It's called indirect realism, I think. But what I've realized recently is that it's much deeper than that. And strangely enough, the allegory of the cave is people. This is what's so interesting to me. In the allegory of the cave, how people view reality are shadows. They can only see shadows. And what shadows are projections of real objects. In this case, three-dimensional objects being projected from a light source, which is the fire in the cave, projected onto a screen, a two-dimensional surface, which results in a two-dimensional projection of the puppet, the figure. And so what these captives are perceiving are projections. And I don't know if that old allegory is supposed to allude to actual field physics. And I think that it might. I think that it actually might be an actual statement about physical reality as being a shadow. So let me kind of unpack that a little bit. Starting with Ken Wheeler. Ken Wheeler a few times has mentioned Poincaré disk model. And I think he said that the field geometry is represented by the Poincaré disk model. And he's mentioned it a few times, hasn't really gone into much detail about that, as far as I know. And I'm not so certain that statement, that connection to the Poincaré disk model, I'm not certain if that connection matches up to the other things he says about magnetic fields. But I've been thinking about the Poincaré disk model a lot, because I believe that pattern recognition is correct, and I wrote my book, and I kind of like I was basically almost done with my book, and I just stumbled across Ken Wheeler's talking about Poincaré disk model, and so I thought, well, I should bring that up as much as possible, because I'm I don't I'm not copying Ken Wheeler. I'm just I mean our what we say is slightly different. I'm just saying that what he said, he's kind of alluded to the same ideas that I talk about. So that's all I'm saying. And so basically, the Poincare disk model, how I see it is, it's a stereographic projection in a particular format with a boundary, and the holographic principle, the more modern, the big theory regarding reality, and it has to do with like strings and everything. And they do the same thing. They say that, well, this black hole resembles basically Poincare disk model. So the same thing right there, and that I find to be accurate, because if you look at the magnetic field geometry, just iron filings, doesn't have to be complicated at all. And I know that, the little iron filing doesn't matter. The shape that's made by iron filings is stereographic projection. And if you think about that, if you just sit down and think about that for like 2 years straight, then there's actually a lot to get from that. First of all, like what the light, what projection is there's a light source, but it's not an actual like electromagnetism illumination. We're talking about like a mathematical point of origin, which is actually it's like it's a single point that it's like there's a closed geometry sphere, and then a point is removed, like it's a bubble that's pricked with a needle, and the bubble kind of pops and spreads out into infinity, and it makes like a sphere with a hat, an infinitely large hat, and that missing point. And that missing point is that mathematical light source, which causes the projection. But it doesn't really cause the projection, it is the projection. It's the same thing. And what do I say? What do I say about this next? It's I'll just kind of like stumble through this, just to throw it out there. That mathematical point, why does that exist? Like, well, is that why is that a part of math? Like, if you ask a mathematician, what is that? They say, well, it's a mathematical construct. Okay. And if you're a monist, you understand that there's an objective reality, okay? And the Platonists, they view math as existing in a form of objective reality. Basically, what this all right, let me back up just a little bit. Magnetic geometry if you view it as stereographic projection, what that means is that a magnetic field is a three-dimensional object, which is a projection of a fourth-dimensional object. Being a sphere, we're talking about spheres. So the magnetic field, it's more accurate. Instead of calling it a torus, it's more accurate to think of it as kind of like a Hopf vibration. And the really important part about this, though, is that that's not really what reality is. Okay. Just because in our existence, in our three-dimensional existence, fields are three-dimensional objects, and if you used instruments to measure these fields, they would measure them as three-dimensional objects. And that's how we imagine them. We imagine them as three-dimensional objects. The important part of this idea of projection, though, is that that's not really reality. It's not really a three-dimensional object. Like Ken Willer's talked about this before. He's talked about time and how it's not really a thing. It's because what a dimension is, it's a measurement. And we perceive time not as a measurement, but as a series of increments, like a video, like you envision a video. You don't really see a video as like there's the video. When you imagine it, you imagine it as like a series of moments. When you look at a desk, you can see that it has a length. But you cannot see its time, its fourth dimension. You can see it currently in this particular increment of time. But when you look at a desk, you are not looking at its entire future and its entire past. That's kind of like you'd be able to see the future if you could comprehend the fourth dimension. And that's what projection is. That's the allegory of the cave. This projection isn't really real. The shadows on the wall, they're not actually shadows. You perceive the shadow, but the reality is that three-dimensional object that's being projected by the light source. And I mean that's what a projection is. It's a shadow. And even though a field is three-dimensional, it is technically a shadow of a fourth-dimensional object. And that is very difficult for me to wrap my head around. I've done my best by simply sitting down and thinking about it. At this moment, I've come to the conclusion that, the projection itself is really what causes the geometry. And the projection, what it also causes is a distinction between objects, which is a good word for that, a good technical word for what I'm talking about is reference frames. Projection causes reference frames, and the distinction between objects. And so, I mean, even if you look at it from a three-dimensional perspective, it's concluded that basically all fields are intertwined and arguably the same field, just a single field in a kind of like a self-similar hierarchical structure. But once you move on to the fourth dimension, it's more literal than that, because all fields are just one field. It's just one field, and that means that there's no coherence or decoherence. Coherence and decoherence, magnetic attraction, life and death, movement from point A to point B is all an illusion due to projection from fourth dimension to third dimension. And actually, all of the shapes and all of the things that make up the universe are due to this point, this light source, this mathematical light source. And because an atom is basically its characteristics. I mean, there's no distinction between the two. When you say that there's one field, what you're saying is that there's one atom. Apparently, there are these theories about there being one electron that just zips around. It's actually just one. Everything's just one electron, or atom, whatever, the smallest particle. Or actually, it's infinitely large. If you think about it, it's infinitely large, but there's only one of them, and all of these dichotomies that create our universe are an illusion. And so now I could be totally full of shit, or I could be right, and now I'm going to be murdered by society because I'm enlightened. I don't know. I'm just making a vlog. I think the weak link here is the stereographic projection thing. It's kind of weak, because really it's just, well, it looks like stereographic projection. And at the moment, that's the best I can do on that. But people ask me for where's your mathematical proof? It's already been done. Okay. People tell me all the time, they say, Eric, where's your proof? I'm like, I have the same data as you. That's there might be a lot of problems with our academia, our science, but one thing they're really good at is gathering some pretty good data. Okay, and I'm not trying to contradict any of this good data. I agree 100%. I'm not saying all this data is wrong and here's my new data that contradicts all the other. No, I'm using the same exact data. Just saying the words stereographic projection, I think is good enough. I mean, just Google the equation for stereographic projection. Okay, I'm not a priest in your state religion because I'm not a mathematician. Okay. Whatever, dude. So yeah, also the myth of Prometheus really interesting that the myth of Prometheus is kind of similar to the allegory of the cave, because there's the element of fire that leads to people being imprisoned, chained up. There's the chains, there's the fire, there's the chains, and then there's the ignorance portion. And I think it's really, really interesting that in the Prometheus myth, his liver was eaten, and the liver is supposed to symbolize one's ability to see the future, I think. And that's exactly what projection is. That's literally what projection is. It reduces your ability to see the future. And if you were not subject to this, just like in the allegory of the cave, if you were not subject to the projection, and you somehow were able to exit the cave, then you'd be able to perceive reality as it actually is. And you would see the entire past and future of things. But we can't. And I don't think it's possible this whole thing is monist and panpsychism as a monist view of consciousness already is the claim that consciousness is a characteristic that is inherent to all matter. But to go even deeper, to go a step further, if everything is just one field, if everything is just one thing, there is actually no distinction between my consciousness and your consciousness, or the decoherent consciousness of that rock over there. And that the concept of decoherence versus coherence is an illusion, because really what is coherence? Coherence is just, all it is just a large quantity of things in alignment. There's no like off and on. All things are always on, and they're in the on position all the time, and they can't be turned off. And really, what turning off is just the reduction in coherence. But the smallest particle is on. It doesn't matter if it's decoherent. The smallest particles are on. And the concept of coherence and decoherence doesn't even apply. And so that field that is your self-awareness